All right, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us. Today is the fourth event in our New Name, Same Flaws series. Defending Rights and Dissent is holding the series to share the real story behind Biden's counterterrorism strategy. Spoiler alert, he calls it new, but a lot of it's just recycled war on terror policy. We're here to share what this means for dissent in America. I'm Cody Bloomfield from Defending Rights and Dissent. And today we're focusing on how counterterrorism plays out in schools. We're lucky enough to be joined by Professor Nicole Nguyen. Nicole researches how counterterrorism shapes communities, and she recently wrote a full book about CVE and related policies. The book's called Suspect Communities, Anti-Muslim Racism and the Domestic War on Terror. Nicole's joining us today because she's done research right at the center of the CVE conversation. She's talked with affected communities and activists fighting back against CVE. She's also talked with CVE's biggest cheerleaders, the industry stakeholders, grantees, and law enforcement agencies that keep throwing around the same debunked myth of radicalization theory. So we're very excited to have Nicole here today to talk about how counterterrorism in schools impacts how students see each other, how they see national security, and how this affects their relationships. Nicole, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's jump into it. Can you start by talking about what CVE is and what it looks like in a school setting? You've done all this research talking to these various involved people. So what have you learned from your interviews about how CVE operates in schools, and where's the disjoint between what CVE cheerleaders think it does and what it actually does?
Yeah, so I would say there's, four main ways CVE shows up in schools. It could be a curriculum. So curriculum could be teaching young people how not to be terrorists, or what warning signs of a vulnerability to terrorism are, so they can also participate in identifying friends or family who might be perceived to be vulnerable to terrorist radicalization. It could be young people designing CVE programs themselves. So that could be social media campaigns. It could be education initiatives. So it shows up in all different kinds of ways in the curriculum of school, formally and informally. It also shows up the second way through monitoring and surveillance. So teachers and other school staff being trained in the so-called warning signs of terrorist radicalization, and then using those warning signs in their daily interactions with young people to identify potential terrorists. In the UK, we've seen teachers reporting on each other if they think a teacher might be radicalizing. This could also be hiring outside folks to come into schools to do surveillance and monitoring. This was true in Minneapolis. Minneapolis Public Schools announcing plans to hire these youth intervention workers to monitor school spaces, looking for these signs of terrorist radicalization. The third way is for teachers and school staff to do interventions to supposedly off-ramp young people from the pathway of violent extremism. People may have heard of, and at your own school, you might have interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary teams where it's teachers and administrators, religious leaders, law enforcement, who team together to share information about a young person to try to deter them from, again, so-called terrorist radicalization. And again, it usually involves law enforcement and information sharing channels with the FBI, fusion centers, and other federal agencies. And the fourth and final main way that CVE shows up is just kind of in the air you breathe, right? A teacher goes to a professional development conference and sees a session on, countering violent extremism or terrorist radicalization or Somalia, the Syrian war, and they get these ideas about terrorist radicalization, and it becomes a lens through which they understand and interpret the behaviors of Muslim and Arab children in their classrooms. So those are the four main ways CVE shows up in schools.
Yeah, thank you so much for that detailed explanation. And all the time we see this lumped as like somehow a softer alternative to counterterrorism. Like it's somehow they take it not being a sting operation as a success. And you've been a big critic of the public health model for counterterrorism. But unfortunately, we've seen that public health model gain traction. I'm thinking about a June op-ed in The Atlantic that had the tagline, "Extremism is a public health problem, not a security issue." So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this public health model and how it comes up in the counterterrorism conversation and why that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, so I think in the last year or so, we've heard this phrase, racism is a public health problem. And that phrase is trying to identify that there are these structural conditions related to racism, like access to healthcare, access to housing, and so on, that create all these health inequities. So racism as a public health problem is pointing to these structural conditions. Now, when we're talking about terrorism is a public health problem, security professionals mean that terrorism is like a disease, a contagious disease, an infectious disease that spreads its germs around, and we have to inoculate people from these germs, from these terrorism germs. And part of this is, diseases have symptoms, they have warning signs that someone might be predisposed to having this terrorism germ. And so while racism as a public health problem is trying to get us to look at the structural conditions that create health inequities, terrorism as a public health problem is trying to say that there are these problems that reside in individual people that we need to fix and solve, right? It's about pathologizing culture, religion, politics, and say that, the problem is in individual people. And if we could just identify people who have these warning signs or symptoms of terrorism, we can inoculate them. We can do these interventions, provide these services so they don't turn to terrorism. And this just fundamentally misunderstands what terrorism is, what political violence is, and really absolves the United States of its role in producing the conditions that sort of animate the rise of political violence.
Yeah, I think that talking about extrapolating from the epidemiological model to talk about what this would look like if terrorism were a contagious disease is really insightful. And in your book and in your research, you talk about how CVE creates suspect communities, that there's some sort of ideological shadow game where CVE trains students to fear difference. And too often that fear looks like students learning to fear Black, Brown, and Muslim communities. I was wondering if you could talk about how this kind of paranoia affects students' relationships with each other.
Yeah, so I think you have, the school itself, right? I think oftentimes we think about the school as a so-called safe place and teachers as these trusted adults. And we have to remember that schools are also have prison-like conditions, right? There's already policing happening in schools, and there's already a level of suspicion that's applied to students for racial difference, for politics, for gender, right? All of that's at play. And then you add an additional layer where you say that these are the signs of terrorist radicalization, and part of your duty and your responsibility as a teacher or a student is to identify and look for these signs. You're of course going to create suspicion, or you are a young person and you understand how digital surveillance happens. You understand how physical, interpersonal surveillance happens. So maybe you don't Google something. Maybe you don't check out a book from the library. Maybe you don't make a comment in class, or you say nothing in history class because you're afraid that whatever you say will arouse suspicion that you're a terrorist. And from students, from teachers, you might go to a guidance counselor and you might be experiencing, some of the effects of, if you're an immigrant and you fled war, or you see people back home who are surviving war, but you can't talk about that with your guidance counselor because you're afraid that saying that means you'll be marked as a potential terrorist. So it not only creates these conditions of suspicion, it makes accessing services from education to therapy just outright dangerous. And it doesn't have to be the therapist you're talking to or the guidance counselor you're talking to is actually going to report you, but the mere fear that reporting can happen fundamentally alters the relationship a young person has with that service and service provider. And so that's one of the more insidious effects of CVE is just everything you do becomes suspicious. And one of the ways the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies have said, oh, we don't do this anymore, is to say that we focus on behaviors, not profiles. So we don't racially profile or religiously profile anyone anymore. If you're experiencing homesickness or acculturation-related stress, their terms, economic stressors, then you're vulnerable to violent extremism. And those in no way are racially profiling anyone. But we know that those things only arouse suspicion if they're exhibited by Muslim and Arab students, or they're conditions that have been created by, say, being an immigrant fleeing war, right? That you're having trouble, acclimating to the United States because you're dealing with all of this trauma from surviving military interventions. So the school just becomes another site of surveillance, another site of the war on terror.
Yeah, it's interesting how you put that as CVE is like a form of anti-intellectualism, where students learn to reject differences in view and differences of experience. And yeah, I was wondering if you could just talk a bit more about how like redefining education is through the lens of threat assessment affects how students interact with educational spaces and how that affects their relationships with adults in their lives. I know you touched on this a bit already, but
yeah, I mean, part of this is making it taboo to research, ask questions about anything that comes even close to this idea of terrorism. So if you're interested in Somali civil war, that is itself seen as dangerous, right? Because you might have an interest then in traveling to Somalia to join al-Shabaab. If you're, concerned about Palestine, researching Hamas might be seen as terrorist activity. So these things that should be a part of, a young person's academic development becomes a form of suspicion, and that chills political discussion in the classroom. Young people are quite aware of the different ways they're surveyed and monitored, and they have strategies for dealing with that. And oftentimes that's seeking, their education elsewhere. And then you push these conversations outside of school space, and school once again becomes just sort of learning, state-sponsored curriculum, the narratives that are deemed, acceptable, and so you essentially shut down young people's ability to learn about their own histories or each other's histories in a real and honest kind of way.
Yeah, thank you for that. Since CVE does slot into broader conversations we're having about what's taught in schools, in addition to conversations about surveillance and everything else. And I think one of the particularly nefarious aspects of CVE is how much it gaslights communities of color. Because as you've said in your research, CVE treats these structural issues of racism and inequality as individual problems. I think in one of your papers, you say that CVE treats racism as a misunderstanding, that if you have inner youth councils or whatever, then that'll attack racism. And so this seems particularly damaging when leveled at students who are experiencing the symptoms of systematic racism. So I was wondering if you could talk about how CVE pathologizes these systematic inequalities, and if you could talk about what ramifications that has for dissent.
Yeah, so as I said before, the sort of public health model, treating terrorism through this sort of public health lens means that we don't actually have to talk about any of the structural conditions. So there are young people who get caught up in sting operations or whose innocuous behaviors get read as signs of terrorism. There are young people, though, who are concerned about some of the atrocities they might witness or see on the news or have experienced in their everyday lives. And young people are not allowed to discuss those issues because they're seen as taboo. And part of why it's taboo is because those young people are seen as the problem, right? That their interest in those issues is because they're lonely, because they're alienated, because they're not, they're having trouble assimilating to US culture. And so the problem, all of it resides in the individual body, and essentially tells that young person, this is not about the Syrian war, it's not about Assad, it's not about Somalia, like this is because you have some individual pathology, because you have this theological perversion or you have a psychological perversion, and that's the reason young people have this desire to go fight abroad. And again, this, by locating the problem in a young person, means that all of the issues that young people face around structural racism, around surveillance, becomes their own issue. Like it's their personal responsibility to not experience structural racism, versus saying like the U.S. has occupied countries, military intervene, and that's part of the production of violence. And it also tells young people that they're under suspicion because they've done something wrong, and that they're not experiencing racism. They're experiencing a national security model that is anti-racist from the view of security professionals. And so we see sort of addressing now Biden has said, we're going to address domestic terrorism, so-called white supremacy, through these models. And when Biden says we're addressing white supremacy, he means white supremacy in its most extreme forms. He means, neo-Nazis in the street. He means the Proud Boys, who are inciting violence at the Capitol, and to say nothing of the sort of structural conditions that produce state-sponsored violence in communities. So it has nothing to do with housing and healthcare and policing and so on. And so once again, young people are told, like, if you could just get along with each other, you won't experience racism. If you just learn to assimilate into the United States, if you can get away from identitarian politics, you won't have these issues. So everything, again, is about saying that the problem is with children. And by making the problem children and their vulnerabilities, we don't have to talk about any of the structural conditions in the United States.
Yeah, thank you for that. CVE is incredibly isolating to students at the same time as it just lets the state abdicate responsibility for white supremacy. And when you see Biden officials talking about their new counterterrorism plan, they seem to think that because they did Control F from radical Muslims to radical white supremacists, that solves the problem. Do you see any of the issues with CVE changing now that the Biden administration is at least nominally focusing on white supremacist violence?
I mean, people have talked about how we don't need equal opportunity CVE, that just broadening CVE's aperture to include white supremacists doesn't get at the fundamental problems of CVE, that it's based on these debunked theories, that it disproportionately affects communities of color. But for me, I think the insidious part of what Biden is doing is that he's sort of creating all of these nuances and wrinkles in his domestic terrorism policy that will inevitably come back and sort of boomerang on communities of color. So, for example, there's been news coverage on the sort of January 6th Capitol prosecutions around trying to define what a weapon is, right? Because they're charging people with, assault with a deadly weapon or assault with a weapon. And weapons are like sticks, they're flagpoles, they're all kinds of things that we don't typically consider as weapons. And I can see this then coming back to be used against political protesters of color, right, as a way to arrest and harshly prosecute people. We see two people from Iowa who sabotaged the Dakota Access Pipeline, who pled guilty to charges and are labeled domestic terrorists and were subjected to a harsher sentence for committing what was considered a federal crime of terrorism. So we can see how the focus on white supremacists is kind of a ploy to sort of strengthen the police, essentially anti-Black, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, anti-Indigenous protest policing, and so that is, for me, it's not only it's doubling down on a program that doesn't work and that harms Muslim and Arab communities, it's also creating, in the process, it's creating additional tools and logics to criminalize those communities.
I really appreciate that. And yeah, like after January 6th, we saw some anti-protest bills that just recirculated language from anti-Black Lives Matter bills and anti-Dakota Access protest bills. And so I really appreciate your research-informed insight into both where CVE just plain doesn't work, and then also how nefarious CVE really is. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks to everyone who tuned in today. We'll have another event next week, same time. That'll be Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific. Next week, we're having disability justice advocate Dara Baldwin on to talk about why CVE is a disability justice issue. So thanks again to Nicole, and thanks for everyone who tuned in.